Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's Michael Williams. I had just turned 34 when we arrived at the Hocking Hills in Ohio, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. I should have known something was wrong when Jenny found the first bone. We'd been married for 3 years, but this was our first real camping trip together. Jenny had been pushing for it since spring, something about reconnecting with nature and getting away from the digital world. I'd finally caved when she found a deal on renting a small RV for the weekend. The Hocking Hills seemed perfect, close enough to home in Columbus that we wouldn't feel completely isolated, but remote enough to satisfy Jenny's craving for wilderness. The rental lot smelled like diesel fuel and stale cigarettes. Our RV was a 30-foot Winnebago that had seen better decades, with faded brown stripes and a door that stuck. The owner, a grizzled man named Pete with nicotine-stained fingers, walked us through the basics. "You folks heading anywhere in particular?" he asked, checking off items on his clipboard. "Hocking Hills State Park," Jenny said, practically bouncing with excitement. Her dark hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and for a moment I remembered why I'd fallen in love with her. She had this infectious enthusiasm for new experiences that usually swept me along, despite my natural pessimism. Pete's pen stopped moving. "Which part?" "There's this dispersed camping area we found online," I said, pulling out my phone to show him the coordinates. "About 15 miles southeast of the main park. Real secluded." He studied the numbers, and something shifted in his weathered face. That's Old Crow Ridge territory." "Is that bad?" Jenny asked. Pete handed back the clipboard without meeting our eyes. Just stick to the established campsites. The dispersed areas can be tricky, easy to get turned around." We should have listened, but Jenny was already climbing into the driver's seat, adjusting the mirrors with the confidence of someone who'd driven her father's motorhome as a teenager. I took shotgun, and we pulled out of the lot with the windows down and classic rock playing from the tinny speakers. The drive southeast took us through rolling hills covered in dense forest. October in Ohio painted everything in shades of amber and rust, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. Jenny sang along with the radio, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand. For the first time in months, I felt the knot of work stress in my shoulders begin to loosen. We turned off the main highway onto progressively smaller roads. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then to dirt ruts barely wide enough for the RV. Tree branches scraped against the sides with sounds like fingernails on metal. According to the GPS, we were close to our coordinates, but I hadn't seen another vehicle, or any sign of civilization, in over an hour. "This is perfect," Jenny breathed as we finally reached a small clearing. "Look, Michael, it's like our own private world." She wasn't wrong. The clearing was maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by towering oaks and maples. A small creek ran along the eastern edge, the water so clear you could see the smooth stones on the bottom. The late afternoon light gave everything a warm, golden glow that looked like something from a travel magazine. I maneuvered the RV into position while Jenny walked the perimeter, pointing out where she wanted to set up our camp chairs and planning a hiking route for the next morning. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself actually looking forward to a weekend of s'mores and sleeping under the stars. That was when she found the first bone. "Michael, come look at this," she called from the southern edge of the clearing. Her voice carried an odd note. Not quite alarm, but not casual curiosity either. I found her crouched near the tree line, brushing dirt and leaves away from something white. At first glance, it looked like a stick, but as more of it was revealed, the distinctive shape became unmistakable. "It's a femur," Jenny said. She worked as a physical therapist, so she knew bones. "Probably from a deer. See how the ends are chewed? Coyotes or something?" I nodded, though something about it bothered me. The bone was positioned too deliberately, too carefully placed. But Jenny had already moved on, walking a slow circle around the spot. "Oh my God," she whispered. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. She'd found more bones. Lots more. They formed a rough circle maybe 10 feet in diameter, half buried under years of fallen leaves and debris. Ribs, vertebrae, what looked like pieces of skull, all gleaming white in the fading light. "We should go," I said immediately. This is wrong, Jenny. This isn't natural." But she was already moving around the circle, counting under her breath. 12, 13, 14 sets. "Michael, this is incredible. It's like some kind of natural predator cache, or maybe a Native American ritual site. Or maybe it's where some psycho buries his victims." She shot me a look. "Don't be paranoid. These bones are old, really old. Look at the weathering, the way they've settled into the ground. This is probably an archaeological site." I wanted to argue, but Jenny had that look in her eyes, the same one she'd had when she decided we should get married after dating for only 8 months, or when she quit her steady job to go back to school. Once she'd made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. We set up camp as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Jenny insisted on positioning our chairs so we could see the bone circle, which she'd started calling the monument. I tried to focus on the positive. The peaceful sound of the creek, the way the campfire painted dancing shadows on the trees, the fact that we had no cell service and couldn't be interrupted by work calls, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It started as just an itch between my shoulder blades, the kind of sensation you get when someone's staring at you from across a crowded room. Every time I looked toward the tree line, though, there was nothing there. Just darkness between the trunks and the occasional reflection of our firelight off a spider's web or piece of bark. Jenny seemed oblivious. She'd brought a field journal and was sketching the bone arrangement by firelight, occasionally looking up to point out a constellation or comment on the calls of night birds. Her face was animated in a way I hadn't seen in months, and I found myself relaxing, despite my earlier unease. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, leaning against my shoulder as we watched the flames dance. "Just us. No distractions. No pressure to be anywhere or do anything." I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with wood smoke. "I love you," I said, and meant it more than I had in weeks. We stayed up until the fire burned down to coals, talking about everything and nothing. Work drama, childhood memories, plans for the future. Jenny had been pushing to start a family, and for the first time, sitting there under more stars than I'd seen since I was a kid, it didn't seem like such a terrifying prospect. Around midnight, we retreated to the RV. The bed was smaller than we were used to, but we made it work, falling asleep curled together like puzzle pieces. I slept more deeply than I had in months. I woke to the sound of Jenny screaming. Pale morning light filtered through the RV's small windows, and Jenny was sitting bolt upright in bed, pointing toward the main window above our heads. Her face was white, her dark hair plastered to her head with sweat. "There was someone out there," she gasped, "standing right outside the window, watching us." I scrambled to look, but saw only trees and the remnants of our campfire. What did they look like? I don't know. Tall, I think. But they were gone the second I screamed. She was shaking, whether from cold or adrenaline I couldn't tell. "Michael, I swear to God someone was standing right there, maybe 2 feet from the window, just staring." I grabbed my clothes and the baseball bat I'd brought for peace of mind. Jenny had rolled her eyes at the time, but I was grateful for it now. "Stay inside. Lock the door behind me." The morning air was crisp and filled with the sounds of waking forest. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant sound of water over stones. I walked a complete circle around the RV, looking for footprints or any sign that someone had been there, but the ground was too hard and covered with too many leaves to show clear tracks. I was about to give up when I saw them. Fresh scratches in the dirt near the RV's front bumper. Not footprints exactly, but marks like something had been dragged or scraped across the ground. The scratches formed a rough pattern, lines radiating out from a central point like a crude drawing of the sun, or like the arrangement of bones we'd found the night before. "Find anything?" Jenny called from the doorway. She'd gotten dressed and made coffee, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. I showed her the marks and watched her face cycle through confusion, fear, and finally a kind of stubborn rationality. "It could be from anything," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "An animal, maybe. Or the wind blew some debris around." We both knew wind doesn't make patterns like that, but neither of us said so. We spent the morning trying to recapture the magic of the previous evening. Jenny made pancakes on the RV's small stove while I rebuilt the fire and boiled water for coffee. We talked about hiking plans and discussed whether to stay another night or head home early. But the conversation felt forced, and we both kept glancing toward the tree line. It was Jenny who suggested we explore the bone circle in daylight. "I keep thinking about it," she said as we finished breakfast. "What if it really is some kind of archaeological site? We could be the first people to document it properly." In the clear light of morning, the arrangement looked even more deliberate. The bones formed a perfect circle, and they were positioned with an almost architectural precision. Each skeleton, and there were definitely at least a dozen complete sets, was laid out with the skull pointing toward the center. Jenny knelt at the edge of the circle, her field journal open as she sketched and took notes. "Michael, look at this. The positioning is too precise to be natural. And look at the skulls. They're all facing inward." I crouched beside her, studying the nearest skull. It was definitely from a deer, with the characteristic elongated shape and empty eye sockets. But there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. "Jenny," I said slowly, "look at the jaw." She looked where I was pointing and sucked in a sharp breath. The skull's jaw was wired shut with what looked like copper wire, green with age. As we looked more carefully, we could see that every skull in the circle had the same modification. "What the hell?" Jenny whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. Whistling. It was coming from deep in the woods, a simple melody repeated over and over. Children's tune, something that might have been London Bridge or Mary Had a Little Lamb, but distorted and slowed down until it became something sinister. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing off the trees until it was impossible to tell where it originated. Jenny grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "We need to leave. Right now." I didn't argue. We ran back to the RV, threw our gear inside with no regard for organization, and I had us on the road within 10 minutes. The narrow dirt track seemed even more treacherous going out, with branches scraping against the windshield and rocks pinging off the undercarriage. But as we reached the first turn, the one that should have taken us back toward the main road, I realized something was wrong. The track continued straight ahead, but there was no turn, no junction, just more narrow dirt road disappearing into the forest. "That's not right," I said, slowing down. "We definitely came in from the left. There should be a turn here." Jenny was checking the GPS on her phone, but the screen showed only static. No signal, but we definitely made a left turn getting in here. I backed up and tried again, looking for tire tracks from our arrival. But the road surface was too hard to show clear marks, and every gap in the trees looked like it could be the right path. After 20 minutes of trying different routes, we ended up back at our campsite. "This is impossible," Jenny said, but her voice was tight with fear. "Roads don't just disappear." I tried the GPS unit in the RV, but it showed our location as a blank gray area. No roads, no landmarks, nothing. According to the satellites, we were sitting in empty forest. The whistling started again just as the sun was setting. This time it was closer, maybe 50 yards from the RV. The same childish melody, but played with mathematical precision. Each note held for exactly the same length, each pause timed perfectly. It was the kind of precision that no human could maintain, and definitely not something a child could do. Jenny was pressed against the RV's front window, trying to see into the gathering darkness. "There," she whispered, "between those two oak trees. Do you see it?" I looked where she was pointing and felt my mouth go dry. There was a figure standing motionless between the trees, tall and impossibly thin. In the dim light, I couldn't make out details, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, arms too long, head tilted at an angle that would break a human neck. As we watched, it raised one of those two long arms and waved. "Get away from the window," I said, pulling Jenny back. "Don't look at it. Don't let it know we can see it." But the damage was done. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound like laughter, if laughter could be made of wind and breaking branches and the screams of dying animals. Then, silence. We spent that night huddled together in the RV's tiny bedroom, every light in the vehicle turned on. Around 3 a.m. we heard footsteps on the roof, slow, deliberate steps that moved from front to back and side to side, as if whatever was up there was examining every square inch. The footsteps stopped directly above our bed. For almost an hour, we lay there listening to small sounds. Scratching, tapping, what sounded like something being carved into the metal. Jenny was crying silently, her face buried against my chest, and I was fighting every instinct that told me to run outside and confront whatever was up there. When morning came, I climbed onto the RV's hood and looked at the roof. There were symbols carved into the metal, the same radiating pattern we'd found in the dirt, but repeated dozens of times across the entire surface. Each one was cut deep enough to expose the bright metal underneath, and they were arranged in perfectly straight lines like some kind of bizarre circuit board. "We're going to walk out," I told Jenny. "Leave the RV, take only what we can carry, and follow the creek downstream. Water always leads to civilization eventually." She nodded, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. "What about our stuff? The rental deposit?" "Fuck the deposit. I just want to get us home alive." We packed light, water, energy bars, a first aid kit, the baseball bat. I left a note on the RV's dashboard with our names and contact information, just in case someone found it later. The creek was shallow enough to walk in, and I figured if we stayed in the water, we couldn't get lost. Water flows downhill. Downhill leads to bigger water, and bigger water leads to people. For the first 2 hours, the plan seemed to work. The creek meandered through beautiful forest, passing over small waterfalls and through pools where fish darted between the rocks. If not for our situation, it would have been peaceful, almost idyllic. Jenny walked behind me, occasionally calling out observations about plants or animal tracks. She was trying to stay positive, but I could hear the strain in her voice. Every 30 minutes, I checked my watch and called back our progress to keep her spirits up. That's when I realized we'd been walking for 4 hours. But my watch showed we'd only been gone for 90 minutes. "Jenny," I said, stopping so suddenly she bumped into me. "What time do you have?" She checked her phone. 1:15. "Why?" My watch showed 11:45. The same time it had shown when we'd started walking. "That's impossible," I said, staring at the hands frozen in place. "This watch is automatic. It never stops." Jenny grabbed my wrist and studied the watch face. As we stared, the second hand gave a small twitch, moved backward 3 seconds, then stopped again. "Time doesn't go backwards," she whispered. "No," I said, "it doesn't." That's when we heard the whistling again, but this time it was coming from ahead of us, from the direction we'd been walking. The same childish melody, but now it seemed to be leading us somewhere. We started walking backward, stepping carefully on the slippery creek stones. But every time we changed direction, the whistling moved to stay in front of us. And slowly, gradually, we realized it was herding us back toward our campsite. "It's playing with us," Jenny said. Her voice was flat, emotionless, like a cat with a mouse. 2 hours later, according to our phones, though my watch insisted we'd been walking for negative time, we were back at the bone circle. But it had changed. The circle was bigger now, maybe 20 feet across instead of 10, and there were fresh bones mixed in with the old ones. Bones that were still pink with meat, still wet with blood. As we watched in horror, flies began to buzz around the newest additions. "Those are human bones," Jenny said. She was beyond fear now, speaking with the clinical detachment of her physical therapy training. "Radius and ulna from the forearm. Part of a rib cage. That's definitely a human skull." The human skull was positioned at what seemed to be the head of the circle, and its jaw was wired shut with the same green copper wire we'd seen on the deer skulls. But unlike the animal bones, this skull was facing outward. toward us. "We need to complete the circle," Jenny said. I stared at her. "What? Don't you see?" She was smiling now, the same expression she'd had when she'd decided we should take this trip. "We're part of it. We've always been part of it. That's why the roads disappeared, why time doesn't work right here. We're not visitors. We're the final piece." She started walking toward the circle and I grabbed her arm. "Jenny, no, that's not you talking. Something's wrong. Something's in your head." She looked at me with eyes that were her own, but also not her own. "Michael, I can see it now. The pattern, the purpose. We found this place because we were supposed to, because we belong here." I tried to pull her back, but she was stronger than she should have been, and my hands kept slipping off her arms like she was coated in something slick. She walked to the center of the bone circle and lay down, arranging herself with the same precise positioning as the skeletons around her. "Come on, Michael. Complete the circle." The whistling started again, but this time it was coming from Jenny's mouth. The same childish melody, played with that inhuman precision. As I watched in horror, her jaw began to move in ways that jaws aren't supposed to move, stretching and unhinging like a snake's. I ran through the forest without any plan except to get as far from the bone circle as possible. Branches tore at my clothes and face, roots caught my feet and sent me sprawling, but I kept running. Behind me, the whistling followed, sometimes seeming to come from Jenny, sometimes from the trees themselves. I don't know how long I ran. Time still wasn't working properly. My watch showed different times every time I looked at it, sometimes running backward, sometimes jumping forward by hours. The sun seemed to move in stutters across the sky, and I had the disorienting sensation that I was running through the same stretch of forest over and over. Eventually, I collapsed next to a fallen log, my lungs burning and my legs shaking with exhaustion. The whistling had stopped, and for the first time in what felt like days, the forest was quiet. That's when I saw them. Bones, arranged in a perfect circle around the log where I'd fallen. Human bones this time, dozens of skeletons all positioned with mathematical precision, all facing inward, all with jaws wired shut with green copper wire, and in the center of this new circle, a fresher skeleton, still wearing the tattered remains of a Hocking Hills State Park ranger uniform. I scrambled backward, but there were more circles. Everywhere I looked, bone circles, hundreds of them, stretching away between the trees like a vast cemetery, each one containing a dozen or more skeletons, each one with a fresher corpse at its center. Some of the circles were ancient, the bones weathered to gray and crumbling. Others looked recent, with shreds of clothing and flesh still clinging to the ribs. One contained what looked like a family, 2 adults and 3 small skeletons that could only have been children. And in the distance, I could see a new circle being formed. Jenny was there, lying motionless in the center, but around her, other figures were placing bones with careful precision. Tall, impossibly thin figures with 2 long arms and heads that tilted at wrong angles. They worked in absolute silence, their movements perfectly coordinated. As I watched, one of them looked up and saw me. It raised one spindly arm and waved, the same gesture I'd seen the night before. Then they all turned toward me and started walking. I ran again, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. But no matter which direction I went, I kept finding more bone circles, more evidence of whatever had been happening in this forest for God knew how long. The thin figures followed at a steady pace, never hurrying, never falling behind. They knew they didn't need to rush. They knew I couldn't really escape. It was getting dark again when I found the road. Not the dirt track that had led to our campsite, but a real road. Paved asphalt with yellow lines down the middle and reflectors glinting in the headlights of an approaching car. I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms and screaming for help. The car, a sheriff's deputy, skidded to a halt just feet from where I stood. "Jesus Christ, son, what happened to you?" The deputy was a middle-aged man with gray hair and kind eyes. His nameplate read, Sheriff Morrison. I tried to explain, but the words came out as incoherent babble about bone circles and thin figures and Jenny lying motionless in the forest. Morrison got me into the passenger seat and called for backup and an ambulance. "There's a woman out there," I kept saying. "My wife. She's in the woods." "They have her. We'll find her," Morrison said. But I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Can you tell me where you last saw her?" I tried to give directions, but I realized I had no idea where I was or how far I'd run. The forest all looked the same in the darkness, and I couldn't even remember what direction I'd come from. They searched for 3 days. Helicopters, search dogs, volunteer teams from 3 counties. They found our RV exactly where we'd left it, with my notes still on the dashboard. But they didn't find Jenny, and they didn't find any bone circles. "Could be she fell into a sinkhole," Morrison told me on the 3rd day. "We've got a lot of limestone caves in this area. Sometimes the ground just opens up and swallows things." But I knew better. I knew what had really happened, even if I couldn't prove it. The official report listed Jenny as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. I was treated for dehydration and released after a psychological evaluation that concluded I was suffering from trauma-induced hallucinations. The rental company charged me for damage to the RV. Apparently, someone had carved symbols all over the roof. I moved away from Ohio 6 months later, but it didn't help. Every night I dream about bone circles and figures with 2 long arms. Sometimes I hear whistling in the distance, that same childish melody played with inhuman precision. And sometimes, when I'm walking alone at night, I see Jenny standing between streetlights or at the edge of parking lots. She's exactly as she was that last morning, but her jaw hangs open at an impossible angle, and copper wire glints in the shadows of her mouth. She waves at me with movements that are too fluid, too precise. Then she turns and walks away, and I know she's leading me somewhere. Back to the forest, back to the circles, back to complete the pattern. I know I should follow her. Part of me wants to. Part of me has always belonged in that place, and fighting it is like swimming against a riptide that gets stronger every day. But I'm still fighting, still trying to warn people, even though no one believes me. Still hoping that someday, someone will listen and stay away from Old Crow Ridge, because the circles are still there, still growing, and they're always looking for new pieces to complete the pattern. They're always whistling that song, calling people home. Story 2. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's Michael Williams. I had just turned 34 when we arrived at the Hocking Hills in Ohio, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. The RV dealership in Columbus had been so proud of their gently used 2019 Winnebago Travato. "Perfect for couples wanting to explore Ohio's wilderness," the salesman had said with that practiced smile. Sarah and I needed this trip. After 18 months of marriage counseling, of sleeping in separate beds, of conversations that felt like hostage negotiations, we were running out of ways to save what we'd built together. One last try, she'd whispered the night before we left, her fingers tracing the wedding ring she'd started wearing again. "Just you and me and the road." The road. Interstate 77 had given way to winding state routes, then to the kind of backcountry paths that made our GPS stutter with uncertainty. We'd been driving for 6 hours when Sarah spotted the turnoff, a narrow dirt track barely visible between towering oaks, marked only by a weathered wooden sign. "Pine Hollow Trail. No maintenance beyond this point. Mike, look." She pointed through the passenger window and I saw them immediately. Flags. Red fabric strips tied to branches every 50 feet or so, disappearing into the forest like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. But these weren't the bright orange or pink markers hikers usually left. These were dark, almost rust-colored, and they moved wrong in the breeze. Heavy and wet-looking. "Trail markers?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. "Must be. Come on, when's the last time we did something spontaneous? When's the last time we did anything together?" I thought but didn't say. Instead, I turned the wheel. The RV lurched as we left pavement for packed earth. Pine branches scraped against the sides with sounds like fingernails on chalkboard. The flags continued, always just ahead, always leading deeper. I should have noticed how quiet it was getting, how the usual forest sounds, Birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant hum of civilization were fading to nothing. "This is beautiful," Sarah breathed, pressing her face to the window. For the first time in months, she sounded genuinely happy. "Look at those trees, Mike. When's the last time you saw forest this untouched?" I was about to answer when the trail split. To the left, a normal-looking path continued into mixed hardwoods. To the right, the bloody flags led into what looked like older forest, massive pines whose canopy blocked most of the afternoon sun. The GPS screen flickered and went black. "Which way?" I asked. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Follow the flags." Follow the flags. Christ, if I'd known what those words would cost us. The path to the right was barely wide enough for the RV. Branches scraped and grabbed at our mirrors. The flags grew more frequent now, sometimes 3 or 4 to a single tree, all of them that same dark red that made my mouth taste like copper. The trees pressed closer, their trunks scarred with deep gouges that looked almost like claw marks. "How far do you think this goes?" Sarah asked after we'd been driving for another 20 minutes. I was about to say we should turn around. The path was getting too narrow, and I was having trouble seeing where we were going in the growing darkness under the canopy, when it opened into a clearing. Perfect. Too perfect. A circle of grass maybe 100 feet across, ringed by those massive pines. In the center, someone had built a fire pit from river stones, even had a picnic table, weathered gray but solid. It was like finding a parking space right in front of the restaurant you wanted to visit. "Oh, Mike." Sarah's voice was soft with wonder. "This is perfect." I pulled the RV to the edge of the clearing and killed the engine. The silence hit us immediately. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of absolute stillness that makes you check if you've gone deaf. No insects, no bird calls, no wind in the trees. "Kind of quiet," I said. "I love it." Sarah was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "It's like we're the only people left in the world." We set up camp as the sun began to set. Sarah handled the RV's stabilizers and electrical connections while I gathered wood for the fire pit. The forest floor was carpeted with deadfall, but every piece I picked up was either too wet or too dry, crumbling to punk in my hands. I had to venture 30 feet into the tree line before I found anything usable. That's when I noticed the other flags. These weren't tied to branches. They were driven into the ground on stakes, forming a rough circle around our clearing maybe 50 feet back in the trees. Same dark red fabric, but these were bigger, older. Some were so weathered they hung in tatters. "Sarah," I called, "come look at this." "In a minute. I'm trying to get the water pump working." I walked the perimeter, counting flags. 24 of them, evenly spaced. Each one planted at the base of a tree that bore those same claw marks I'd noticed earlier. The gouges were deep, cutting through bark into the pale wood beneath. Some were fresh, oozing sap. Others had healed over into twisted scars. At the base of one flag, something caught the dying light. I knelt for a closer look and felt my blood turn to ice water. Bones. Small ones, probably from rabbits or squirrels. But they were arranged in a careful pattern around the flag's base. A circle within a circle, with something that might have been a crude symbol scratched into the earth at the center. "Mike!" Sarah's voice, sharp with frustration. "The water pump's dead, and I can't get any cell signal." I jogged back to find her standing beside the RV, phone held high above her head. "Nothing," she said. "Not even a single bar. The bones were probably just—" "What bones?" I pointed toward the tree line, but from here you couldn't see the flags in the growing darkness. "Nothing. Animal remains. Natural." She studied my face. After 16 years together, she knew when I was lying. "Mike, what did you find?" Before I could answer, a sound drifted through the trees. Distant at first, but growing closer. Rhythmic, like someone beating a drum. Thump, thump, thump. Sarah grabbed my arm. "What is that?" The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing off the trees. As it grew louder, I realized it wasn't quite like a drum. More organic, like a massive heartbeat. Probably just... I started, then stopped. Just what? There was no innocent explanation for that sound. Thump, thump, thump. It's getting closer. Sarah whispered. The sound reached a crescendo, so loud it seemed to vibrate in our chests, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. "Maybe we should," Sarah began. A branch cracked somewhere in the forest. Then another. Something large was moving out there just beyond the circle of flags. "Inside," I said. "Now." We scrambled into the RV, and I locked the door behind us. The familiar smell of fake wood paneling and upholstery cleaner should have been comforting, but the tiny space felt like a trap now. Sarah was at the kitchenette window peering out through the blinds. "I can't see anything." I joined her, pressing my face to the glass. The clearing looked normal in the moonlight. Our fire pit, the picnic table, the ring of trees. Nothing moving. Nothing wrong. "There," Sarah breathed. I followed her gaze and saw it. A shape at the edge of the clearing just inside the tree line. Tall and thin, standing perfectly still between two pines. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but it looked wrong somehow. The proportions were off. "Is that a person?" Sarah whispered. Before I could answer, the shape moved. Not walked. Moved. It glided between the trees without seeming to touch the ground, circling our clearing. Always staying just at the edge of the light, never quite visible enough to see clearly. We watched in silence for maybe 10 minutes as the thing, whatever it was, continued its circuit. Sometimes it would stop, and I'd swear it was looking directly at us through the RV's windows. Then it would move on, always keeping to that perfect circle just inside the flags. "It's not coming closer," I whispered. "The flags," Sarah said suddenly. "It's staying behind the flags." She was right. The shape never crossed into the clearing proper, never came inside the perimeter marked by those dark red banners. "You think there's some kind of barrier?" Sarah didn't answer. She was staring at something else now. Something behind the circling figure. "Mike, there are more." I pressed harder against the glass and my blood went cold. She was right. There were other shapes now, maybe 6 or 7 of them, all maintaining that same careful distance, all staying behind the flags. "What the hell are they?" I breathed. "I don't know." Sarah's voice was barely audible. "But I don't think they can cross the flags." We watched until nearly midnight, taking turns at the window while the other tried to rest. The shapes never left, never came closer, never did anything but maintain their vigil at the edge of our clearing. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and we both collapsed on the RV's narrow bed. I dreamed of red flags and heartbeat drums, of shapes in the darkness that had too many arms and faces that weren't quite human. I woke to Sarah shaking my shoulder, gray dawn light filtering through the blinds. "Mike, wake up, they're gone." I stumbled to the window. The clearing was empty, no sign of our watchers from the night before. Even the flags seemed different in daylight, just faded red fabric. Nothing sinister about them. Maybe it was just... I started. "Don't," Sarah's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare tell me we imagined that." She was right. We'd both seen them. But in the morning light, with coffee brewing and normal RV sounds all around us, it was easier to push the memory aside. "We should go," I said. "This place gives me the creeps." "No." Sarah was at the stove, scrambling eggs like nothing had happened. "We came here to work on us, remember? Running away at the first sign of trouble is exactly what we always do. Sarah, this isn't relationship counseling. Something is seriously wrong here." "Like what? Some shapes in the forest that didn't even come near us?" "Mike, we've been fighting for 2 years. Every conversation turns into an argument. Every attempt at romance dies in passive-aggressive bullshit. For the first time in months, we're working together. We're on the same side." She wasn't wrong. The terror of the night before had pushed us closer than we'd been in ages. We'd held each other, whispered reassurances, acted like partners instead of adversaries. "One more night," she said. "If nothing happens, we'll stay another day. If something does, we'll leave first thing in the morning." Against every instinct screaming in my head, I agreed. The day passed peacefully. We hiked the edges of the clearing, explored the immediate area, even tried to follow some of the trails leading away from our camp. But every path we took seemed to curve back on itself, returning us to the same spot. It was like the forest was designed to keep us in the clearing. Sarah found it charming. It's like this place wants us to stay. I found it terrifying. As evening approached, I noticed the flags again. In daylight, I could see they weren't just fabric. There were other things tied to the stakes. Small bones, twisted bits of metal, what looked like dried. I didn't want to think about what it looked like. Sarah, I really think... Shh. She was sitting at the picnic table, sketching in a notebook she'd brought. Listen. I listened. Birds were singing. Normal forest sounds had returned with the sunset. For the first time since we'd arrived, the place felt alive. See? She smiled at me, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen in months. It's beautiful here. Maybe she was right. Maybe the previous night had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe we'd both been so wound up from our marital problems that we'd imagined threats where none existed. We grilled burgers on the camp stove and talked like we used to. About books, about plans for the future, about the renovations we wanted to make to the house. As darkness fell, I actually found myself relaxing. That lasted until the drumming started. Thump, thump, thump. Same rhythm as before, but louder this time. Much louder. The sound seemed to come from the earth itself, vibrating up through our feet. Sarah's face went white. Mike? Inside, now. We ran for the RV, but I stopped at the door. Something was different this time. The shapes were there at the forest edge, but they were closer. Much closer. And they weren't alone. Oh, Christ, I whispered. There were dozens of them now. Tall, impossibly thin figures standing between the trees. Some looked almost human. Others didn't. They formed a complete circle around our clearing, shoulder to shoulder, all facing inward, all facing us. Mike, come on! Sarah was tugging at my arm, but I couldn't move, because I could see their faces now in the moonlight, and they were wrong. All wrong. Too many eyes, or no eyes at all. Mouths that opened too wide. Some had features that seemed to shift and change as I watched, and they were all smiling. The flags, I said. They're still behind the flags. Sarah followed my gaze and gasped. She was right. Despite being much closer, despite the sheer number of them, they still maintained that careful distance from the red markers. That's when I noticed something else. The flags were glowing. Not brightly, but there was definitely a faint luminescence coming from the fabric, like a foxfire on rotting wood. What are those things? Sarah whispered. One of the shapes, the tallest one standing directly opposite our RV, opened its mouth and spoke. The voice carried clearly across the clearing, though its lips didn't move in sync with the words. Come out. The words were perfectly clear, perfectly human, but wrong somehow. Like someone playing a recording at the wrong speed. Come out and join us. Don't answer, I hissed, pulling Sarah toward the RV door, but she was staring at the thing that had spoken. Mike, that's my voice. She was right. It was her voice, pitched lower and distorted, but unmistakably hers, as if something had been listening to her and learning. Come out, Sarah. Now it was my voice coming from that impossible mouth. Come out, Mike. Join us. It's time. Other voices joined in, a chorus of familiar sounds twisted into wrongness. Our parents' voices, friends, co-workers, people we hadn't seen in years, all calling for us to leave the safety of our clearing. Don't listen, I said, but Sarah was already walking toward them. Sarah, no. She turned back to me and her face was peaceful, dreamy. They sound so sad, Mike. So lonely. That's not sadness, that's hunger. But she wasn't listening. She'd reached the edge of the clearing. One hand extended toward the glowing flags. The chorus of voices grew louder, more urgent. Sarah, stop! I lunged after her, tackling her just as her fingers brushed against the nearest flag. The fabric was warm to the touch and sticky, like partially dried blood. The moment I touched it, images flooded my mind. A family in an RV, much like ours, following red flags to this same clearing. The parents arguing while their children played near the fire pit. The drumming starting, the shapes emerging. The family walking calmly into the forest, smiling, never to return. A group of hikers who'd stumbled upon the trail, how they'd laughed at the silly red markers right up until nightfall. How they'd screamed as the things in the forest called to them with the voices of their loved ones. Dozens of others over the years, maybe hundreds, all drawn by the flags, all trapped in this clearing, all eventually walking willingly into the darkness. I yanked my hand away from the flag and dragged Sarah back toward the center of the clearing. The voices stopped immediately, replaced by a sound I'll never forget. Dozens of those things exhaling in unison, a sigh of profound disappointment. Sarah collapsed beside the fire pit, shaking her head as if waking from a dream. What was I doing? The flags, I gasped. Don't touch the flags. The shapes began to move, circling our clearing like wolves around a campfire, but they still couldn't cross the barrier. Whatever power kept them at bay, it was holding. For now, we have to get out of here, Sarah said. How? The trail we came in on. It curves back on itself. Every path leads back here. Then we make our own path. I looked at the RV, then at the forest. You mean drive straight through the trees? If we have to. The shapes were moving faster now, their circuit tightening despite the barrier of flags. Some of them were making sounds, not quite human screams, not quite animal howls. All of them kept calling to us with familiar voices. Mom? Sarah whispered, and I saw her taking a step toward the forest edge. That's not your mother. But it sounds... It's not her. I grabbed Sarah's shoulders, forcing her to look at me. Remember what happened when you touched the flag? It showed you things, didn't it? She nodded slowly. Other people, other campers, they all walked into the forest, just like you were about to do. The voices were getting more insistent, more desperate. Some of the shapes were pressing against the invisible barrier, their forms rippling like smoke where they touched whatever force the flags projected. That's when I saw it. One of the flags, an older one, more tattered than the rest, was flickering. The glow was unsteady, like a candle in the wind. Sarah, we have a problem. She followed my gaze and sucked in a sharp breath. They're failing. Not just one flag now. Several of them were flickering, their protective glow fading in and out. And where the light dimmed, I could see the shapes pressing closer. How long do you think we have? Sarah asked. Before I could answer, one of the flags went out completely. The shape nearest to it immediately lunged forward, crossing into what had been protected space. It was close enough now that I could see it clearly, and I wished I couldn't. It had been human once. Maybe. The basic structure was there. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But everything was wrong. Too tall, too thin, joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. Its face was the worst part. Features that seemed familiar but rearranged, like a photograph that had been cut up and glued back together by someone who'd never seen a human before. And it was wearing clothes. Dirty, torn camping gear that looked like it had been in the forest for decades. Oh, God, Sarah whispered. That's what happened to them. The other campers. They didn't just disappear. They became those things. The creature that had been human opened its mouth and spoke in a perfect imitation of Sarah's voice. Come home, Mike. Come home with me. More flags were failing now. 4, 5, 6 of them guttering out like dying candles. Each time one failed, another shape pressed forward. They were all wearing the remnants of camping gear, hiking boots, outdated clothing. All of them had once been people who'd followed red flags to this clearing. The RV, I said. Now. We ran for our vehicle, but even as we reached it, I knew we were trapped. The keys were inside, and we'd have to open the door to get them. The moment we did that, we'd be exposed. The emergency exit, Sarah said, reading my mind. The roof hatch. The Winnebago had an escape hatch in the ceiling, designed for emergencies exactly like this. We scrambled up the back ladder as more flags failed around us. From the roof, I could see the full scope of our situation. We were surrounded. Completely surrounded. Dozens of those things pressed against the failing barrier, and more were emerging from the forest behind them. The drumming sound was coming from them, I realized. From their hearts, or whatever had replaced their hearts. Start the engine, Sarah said. "The keys are inside. So go get them." I looked down at the sea of twisted faces staring up at us. "I can't. The moment I open that door, then I'll go." "Sarah, no. One of us has to." She was already moving toward the hatch. "I'm smaller. I can move faster." 2 more flags died, and the things that had once been human surged forward. They were maybe 20 feet away now, close enough that I could smell them. Rot and wet earth and something sickly sweet. "Wait." I grabbed Sarah's arm. "There's another way." I'd remembered something from the owner's manual. The Winnebago had a remote start feature, activated by a key fob that should be in Sarah's purse. We found it on the 3rd try, buried under receipts and lip balm. I pressed the button and heard the beautiful sound of the engine turning over. The headlights came on, illuminating the creatures surrounding us. They recoiled from the light like vampires, covering their faces with hands that had too many fingers. Some of them actually seemed to be smoking where the light touched them. "The lights hurt them," Sarah said. "Then we drive with the high beams on." Getting down from the roof and into the RV without being caught was the longest 30 seconds of my life. The creatures pressed close but couldn't seem to approach the direct light. I threw the vehicle in reverse and floored it. We smashed through a line of those things, and I felt the RV rock as we ran over at least 2 of them. In the rearview mirror, I could see them picking themselves up, their forms already beginning to regenerate. The trail we'd followed into the clearing was gone. Not hidden, gone. Where there had been a clear path just hours before, there was now only dense forest. But I didn't care. I kept the pedal down and crashed through undergrowth, smashing saplings and scraping paint from the RV's sides. Behind us, the creatures gave chase. They moved wrong, too fast, covering ground like they were skating across the forest floor rather than running. But they couldn't keep up with our headlights, and whenever they got too close, the beams would send them reeling back. I drove for what felt like hours, crashing through forests that seemed to actively resist our passage. Branches whipped against the windshield. Rocks scraped the undercarriage. At one point, we got stuck in a creek bed, wheels spinning uselessly in the mud, while dark shapes circled just beyond our light. Sarah found a flashlight in the glove compartment, the kind with a really bright LED beam. She climbed back onto the roof and used it to drive the creatures back while I rocked the RV free. Finally, impossibly, we hit pavement. State Route 56, according to a sign that seemed like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I turned toward civilization, toward lights and traffic and normal human beings, and didn't stop driving until we reached a 24-hour truck stop outside Athens. The fluorescent lights of the gas station felt like sanctuary. I parked under the brightest pole I could find, and we sat in the RV, shaking, not quite believing we'd made it out. "We have to tell someone," Sarah said. "Tell them what? That we found monsters in the woods? That there are red flags leading people into a trap? That others are going to follow them?" She was right, but I also knew how insane it would sound. We compromised by calling the Park Service and reporting unusual activity on the Pine Hollow Trail. Whether they'd investigate or just file our report with all the other crank calls, I had no idea. The sun came up as we sat in that truck stop parking lot, and with daylight came the temptation to rationalize what we'd experienced. Mass hallucination, stress-induced psychosis, some kind of gas leak in the RV that had made us both delusional. But I still had scratches on my arms from branches that shouldn't have existed. Sarah still had that sticky red residue on her fingers from when she'd touched the flag. And when we checked our phones, we found dozens of photos we didn't remember taking. Pictures of the clearing, of the fire pit, of shapes moving between the trees. And in every single photo there was one more figure than we remembered seeing. Always at the edge of the frame, always watching us, always smiling. We never went camping again. Sold the RV the same week and moved to an apartment in downtown Columbus, as far from wilderness as we could manage. Our marriage survived, maybe because shared trauma bonds people in ways that counseling never could, or maybe because we both understood how precious normal life really was. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about red flags fluttering in the breeze. I dream about voices calling from the forest, familiar voices begging me to come home. And I dream about that extra figure in our photos, the one that was always watching. Sometimes I wonder if it followed us home from Hocking Hills. Sometimes I catch myself looking for red flags tied to streetlights, to stop signs, to the trees in the park across from our apartment. They wouldn't be that bold, would they? They wouldn't bring their hunt to the city, would they? Last week, Sarah found a piece of red fabric tied to our apartment building's fire escape. Just a small strip, the same rust-dark color as those flags in the forest. She said it was probably nothing, just some trash that had blown there in the wind. But when I touched it, it was warm and sticky, like partially dried blood. And for just a moment I could swear I heard drumming in the distance. Story 3. They warned us about the echo people in Fish Lake National Forest, but we didn't listen. My name is Michael Williams, I'm 34 years old, and what happened during our RV trip last October still makes me check the shadows twice before I sleep. The warning came from a weathered man at the last gas station before we entered the forest. He was filling up a rusted pickup truck when he noticed our brand new Winnebago and the excited chatter of my family. "You folks heading into Fish Lake?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular weight that comes from living in small mountain towns your whole life. "Yes, sir," I replied, pumping diesel into our 30-foot home on wheels. "Planning to camp at Pando Grove for the week. Heard it's beautiful this time of year." The old man's face changed. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around his pale blue eyes, a barely perceptible shake of his head. "Beautiful, yes. But you'd do well to stay away from the aspen groves after dark. And if you hear voices calling to you from the trees—" He paused, studying my face. "Don't answer. Don't even listen too hard." My wife, Sarah, laughed from the passenger seat. "Sounds like local folklore to me. We love a good ghost story, don't we, kids?" Our twins, Emma and Jake, both 16, pressed their faces against the RV's window. "Are there really ghosts in the forest, mister?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with teenage curiosity. The man didn't smile. "Echo people ain't ghosts, miss. They're something else entirely. Something that listens and learns and calls back." He climbed into his truck, then rolled down the window. "If you must go, remember this. If you hear your own voice calling to you from the woods, don't follow it, no matter what it says." We laughed it off, of course. Small-town superstitions designed to spook the tourists. Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months, a chance to disconnect from our busy lives in Denver and spend quality time with the kids before they headed off to college. The Winnebago was our first major purchase together since buying the house, a symbol of all the adventures we'd have as empty nesters. Fish Lake National Forest was everything the brochures promised. Golden aspen leaves created a canopy of fire above us as we navigated the winding mountain roads. The RV handled better than expected, and by late afternoon, we'd found the perfect spot in Pando Grove, a clearing surrounded by the famous clonal aspen colony, the largest living organism on Earth according to the guidebooks. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed as we stepped out to set up camp. The aspens stretched in every direction, their white bark striped with black scars, their leaves rustling in a constant whisper that sounded almost like conversation. Jake was already setting up his camera equipment, determined to get some shots for his photography class. Emma had her sketchbook out, trying to capture the way the afternoon light filtered through the golden canopy. For the first time in months, we were all together, all present, all happy. The first night was perfect. We grilled burgers on the RV's outdoor setup, played cards by lantern light, and told stories while the aspens whispered their ancient secrets around us. The forest felt alive but benevolent, like a protective embrace. It was Emma who first heard the voices. "Did someone call my name?" she asked around 10 p.m., looking up from her sketchpad. We all paused, listening. The aspens rustled in the evening breeze, their leaves creating that distinctive flutter that gives them the nickname quaking aspen. But that was all. "Just the trees, sweetheart," Sarah said, though I noticed her looking toward the darker sections of the grove. No, I definitely heard someone say Emma, like they were calling me. She stood, tilting her head. "There. Do you hear that?" I strained my ears but heard only the forest's natural symphony. Wind through leaves, the distant call of an owl, the creak of tree trunks swaying. I don't hear anything unusual, Em, but Jake lowered his camera. Actually, yeah, there's something. Like voices, but far away. Sarah moved closer to me and I felt the first prickle of unease. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, but I pushed it aside. It's probably other campers. Sound carries in the mountains. We didn't see any other campsites when we drove in, but that didn't mean much. The forest was vast, and we'd only explored a tiny portion of it. The voices, if that's what they were, faded as the night deepened. We retreated into the RV. The four of us crowded into the small living area, playing Monopoly and drinking hot chocolate. The familiar sounds of our family life pushed away any lingering unease. This was what the trip was supposed to be about. Reconnection, simple pleasures, time away from screens and schedules. But as we prepared for bed, Emma paused at the RV's small window above the dinette. "Dad, come look at this." I joined her, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but black forest. Then my eyes adjusted, and I noticed lights. Small, flickering points of illumination moving between the aspen trunks. "Flashlights," I said. "Other campers. They're not moving like flashlights," Emma whispered. "Watch." She was right. The lights drifted rather than walked, following no discernible path. They pulsed and faded in patterns that seemed almost communicative. Like fireflies, but wrong somehow. Too large, too bright, too purposeful. "Probably just some kind of atmospheric phenomenon," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. Mountain air does weird things with light sometimes. Sarah had already gotten Jake settled in the overcab bed and Emma in the convertible dinette. I checked all the locks, something I'd never done on a camping trip before, and made sure the windows were latched. The RV suddenly felt less like a mobile home and more like a fortress. I lay awake long after Sarah's breathing evened out, listening to the forest. The aspens never stopped their whispering, and somewhere in that constant rustle I could almost make out patterns. Almost. The second day started normally enough. We hiked some of the marked trails, visited a small alpine lake, and had a picnic lunch in a meadow dotted with late-season wildflowers. The forest seemed friendly in the daylight, beautiful, peaceful, exactly what we'd hoped for. It was only as evening approached that the wrongness began to creep back in. We were sitting around our camp chairs watching the sunset paint the aspens in shades of gold and amber, when Jake suddenly stood. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Sarah looked around nervously. The previous night's strange lights hadn't been mentioned all day, but I could tell they were on her mind. Someone called my name. From over there. Jake pointed toward a section of the grove where the trees grew more densely together. It sounded like Emma. Emma looked up from her sketchbook, startled. I didn't say anything. "No, not you now. You from when you were little. Remember how you used to call me Jakey when we were kids?" It was that voice. A chill ran down my spine. Emma hadn't called her brother Jakey since they were maybe 8 years old. "Jake, sit down," I said firmly. "It's just the wind." But even as I said it, I heard something. Not words exactly, but a rhythm in the aspen leaves that sounded almost like speech, like whispered conversation in a language I couldn't quite understand. "There," Emma pointed. "Did you see that?" A figure had moved between the trees, just a glimpse of something pale and upright. Too far away to make out details, but unmistakably human in shape. "Hello," I called out, standing. My voice echoed strangely in the grove, seeming to bounce back from multiple directions. "Is someone there?" No response, but the figure moved again, and this time I was sure I saw it. Someone in light-colored clothing, walking slowly between the aspen trunks. "Stay here," I told my family, grabbing a flashlight from the RV. "Dad, don't." Emma caught my arm. "What if it's one of those echo people that man was talking about?" "There are no echo people," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "It's just another camper." I walked toward where I'd seen the figure, my flashlight beam dancing across the white bark of the aspens. The trees seemed to close in around me as I moved deeper into the grove, their branches creating a maze of pale pillars and dark shadows. "Hello," I called again. "We're camped over here if you need anything." My voice echoed back to me. "Hello, we're camped over here if you need anything." But it wasn't quite right. The echo came a fraction of a second too late, and the tone was slightly different, like someone was repeating my words rather than them bouncing off natural surfaces. I stopped walking, suddenly aware that I could no longer see the RV's lights behind me. The aspens all looked the same in my flashlight beam, endless white trunks stretching in every direction. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time, my own voice calling from somewhere ahead of me. "Sarah, kids, where did you go?" But I hadn't spoken those words. I was standing perfectly still, listening. "Sarah? Kids? Where did you go?" The voice came again, definitely mine, but from deeper in the grove. Then, more distantly, "Help me find them. I'm lost." My blood turned to ice water. Whatever was out there in the darkness, it was using my voice, my words, learning. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, following my flashlight beam back toward what I hoped was camp. Behind me, my own voice kept calling, "Wait for me. Don't leave me here." I burst back into the clearing where our RV sat like a beacon of normalcy. Sarah and the twins were huddled by the picnic table, their faces white with fear. "We heard you calling," Sarah said, "but you were calling from 2 different directions. And it didn't sound right," Jake added, "like someone was trying to imitate you." Emma's sketchbook lay open on the table. She'd been drawing while I was gone, and the image made my stomach clench. It showed a figure standing among aspen trees, but the figure had no face, just a smooth, pale oval where features should be. "I don't know why I drew that," Emma whispered. "It just came out." We spent that night locked inside the RV, all of us too frightened to sleep properly. The voices continued throughout the darkness, sometimes our own voices calling to each other, sometimes the voices of people we'd never heard before. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the aspen grove like a twisted conversation. Around 3 a.m., something began tapping on the RV's exterior walls. Not random tapping, a rhythm, like Morse code. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. Over and over, circling the vehicle. "Don't look outside," I whispered to my family. "Whatever happens, don't look outside." But Emma was already peering through the small bathroom window. She gasped and jerked away, her face pale. "What did you see?" Sarah asked. "There were people out there, lots of them, but they were—" Emma struggled for words. "They were wrong, like they were trying to be people but didn't know how." The tapping continued until dawn, then stopped abruptly when the first rays of sunlight penetrated the aspen canopy. We should have left then, should have packed up the RV and driven straight back to Denver. But something kept us there, a compulsion that felt almost outside ourselves. The forest wanted us to stay, and somehow we found ourselves making excuses. "It's probably just our imagination," I said over breakfast, though I didn't believe it. "Mountain isolation can play tricks on your mind." "Maybe we should explore more," Sarah suggested, and I could hear the forced brightness in her voice. "Get familiar with the area. The unknown is always scarier than the known." So we stayed, and that's when things got worse. It started with Jake. On the 3rd morning, he went outside to photograph the sunrise and didn't come back. We found him an hour later, standing motionless among a cluster of aspens about 50 yards from camp. "Jake!" Emma ran to him, but he didn't respond. He was staring up into the canopy, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. "Son?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "What are you looking at?" He turned to me, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. His eyes were unfocused, dreamy. When he spoke, his voice was flat, emotionless. "They're beautiful, Dad. The Echo people. They want to show me something. Jake, come back to the RV." I tried to guide him, but he resisted. "Listen," he said. "They're calling." And they were. The aspen leaves rustled with what sounded like whispered names. Jake, Emma, Sarah, Michael. "Don't listen to them," I said firmly, but even as I spoke I felt the pull. The voices were hypnotic, seductive. They promised understanding, belonging, connection with something vast and ancient. It took all three of us to get Jake back to the RV. Once inside, he seemed to snap out of it, blinking in confusion. What happened? Why am I inside? I was just taking pictures. He didn't remember standing among the trees, didn't remember the voices calling to him, but when he reviewed the photos on his camera, we saw them clearly. Pale figures standing between the aspens, always just at the edge of the frame. And in the last photo, Jake himself stood among them, his face blank and serene. That afternoon, Emma disappeared. We were all inside the RV, playing cards and trying to pretend everything was normal, when she suddenly stood and walked to the door. "I'll be right back," she said in that same flat tone Jake had used. Sarah grabbed her arm. "Where are you going?" "They want to show me my drawing," Emma said. The real version. She was referring to her sketchbook, which now contained dozens of images of the faceless figures. She drew them compulsively, unable to stop, adding more detail to each successive drawing. In the latest ones, the figures had begun to develop features, but they were wrong, like someone had described a human face but never seen one. We managed to keep Emma inside, but she fought us with surprising strength. She stood at the windows, pressing her face against the glass, watching something in the aspen grove that the rest of us couldn't see. "They're lonely," she whispered. "They've been alone for so long. They just want to talk to someone who understands." "Understands what?" Sarah asked. "What it's like to echo," Emma said, and her voice carried that same hollow quality. To be almost real, but not quite. That night was worse than the previous ones. The tapping on the RV walls became more insistent, more complex, and now we could hear our own voices outside, having conversations we'd never had. "I love it here," Sarah's voice said from near the front of the RV. "We should never leave." "The kids are so happy," my own voice responded. "Look how they're growing." "Growing into what?" Jake's voice asked, and there was something wrong with the intonation, like someone had heard the words but didn't understand their meaning. The real Jake was curled up in his bed, wide awake and terrified. The real Sarah clutched my hand so tightly her nails drew blood. The real Emma continued drawing, adding more and more detail to her faceless figures. Around midnight, she held up her sketchbook. The latest drawing showed our RV surrounded by dozens of the pale figures. But now they had faces. Our faces. Perfect copies, but empty somehow. Like masks of ourselves. "They're learning," Emma said in a voice that didn't sound quite like hers anymore. "They're getting better." I snatched the sketchbook away, but the image was burned into my mind. In the drawing, the figures wearing our faces were walking away from the RV, hand in hand, disappearing into the deeper parts of the aspen grove. The fourth day brought a temporary respite. The voices stopped, the tapping ceased, and for a few hours the forest felt almost normal again. We ventured outside carefully, staying close to the RV, and managed to have a somewhat normal breakfast. But as the sun climbed higher, we began to notice the changes. The aspens around our campsite were different. Not obviously, just subtle alterations that became more apparent the longer you looked. Some of the bark patterns had shifted, creating shapes that looked almost like faces. The spacing between trees had changed, forming pathways that definitely hadn't been there before. And the sounds were wrong. The constant rustling of aspen leaves had taken on new rhythms, new patterns. If you listened carefully, and it was impossible not to listen carefully, you could make out fragments of conversation. Our conversation from the past 3 days played back in an endless loop. "Look at this, Dad." Jake had found something at the base of one of the altered aspens. Carved into the white bark, about eye level, was a message. "Welcome home." The letters were perfectly formed but looked fresh, as if they'd been carved moments before. Below them, smaller text. "We've been waiting." "We need to leave," Sarah said, and her voice shook. "Right now." But when we tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch. I checked the fuel gauge, full. The battery was fine. All the connections looked normal. "Let me try," Jake said, sliding into the driver's seat. He had more experience with engines than I did, had rebuilt several cars in high school. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a roar. But instead of the steady rumble of our diesel engine, it sounded different. Hollow, like an echo of an engine rather than the real thing. "Something's wrong with the exhaust," Jake said, but he put the RV in drive anyway. We made it about 50 feet before the engine died completely. The RV coasted to a stop in a small clearing we definitely hadn't seen before, surrounded by aspens that formed a perfect circle around us. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, looking out the windows. This isn't where we were camped. She was right. Our familiar campsite had vanished, replaced by this strange circular grove. The trees here were massive, their trunks easily 3 feet in diameter, their canopy so dense that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor, and in the bark of every single tree, carved at eye level, were messages. "Stay with us. Don't leave us alone. Echo back, be like us, forever." Emma opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and began drawing frantically. This time her drawing showed the circular grove exactly as it appeared outside our windows. But in her version, our RV was empty. We stood outside it, holding hands with the faceless figures, our own faces beginning to blur and fade. "They don't want to hurt us," Emma said, and now her voice carried that hollow echo quality permanently. "They just want us to stay, to be part of the grove, to echo forever." "Emma, listen to me." I knelt beside her, trying to break through whatever influence had taken hold. "Those things aren't people. They're something else, something that copies us but doesn't understand us." But even as I spoke, I felt the pull. The aspens whispered constantly now, their voices becoming clearer with each passing hour. They spoke of belonging, of never being alone, of becoming part of something vast and eternal. The logic was seductive. Why struggle against them when joining them would be so much easier? That evening, as darkness fell over the circular grove, the Echo people finally showed themselves clearly. They emerged from between the aspen trunks like pale shadows gaining substance. At first glance, they looked human, roughly the right size and shape, walking upright. But the longer you looked, the more wrong they became. Their proportions were slightly off, as if someone had described human anatomy but never seen it firsthand. They moved with a fluid grace that was beautiful and terrible, never quite stepping normally. And their faces were the worst part. They were copies of faces, our faces, the faces of other campers who had passed through over the years. But they were imperfect copies, like photographs that had been reproduced too many times. The details were there, but blurred, softened, not quite right. One of them wore my face, but the eyes were too large and too dark. Another had Sarah's features, but the mouth was wrong, the smile too wide. They arranged themselves around the RV in a perfect circle, standing motionless, watching us through the windows. "Don't look directly at them," I warned my family, but it was too late. Emma was already at the window, her face pressed against the glass. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Look how they're learning. Look how they're growing." And they were changing as we watched. The imperfect copies of our faces were becoming more accurate, more detailed. The Echo people were studying us, learning from us, perfecting their mimicry with each passing moment. Jake joined Emma at the window. Then Sarah. Despite my warnings, I found myself drawn there too. The Echo people stood in their circle, perfectly still, perfectly patient, waiting. One of them, the one wearing my face, stepped forward. When it spoke, it used my voice, but the words came from outside the RV and inside my head simultaneously. "Why do you resist?" it asked. "We offer you belonging, permanence, freedom from loneliness, from change, from death." "Because we're not like you," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. "We're alive." "So are we," the thing wearing my face replied. "We live in echo, in repetition, in eternal return. We are the memory of the forest made manifest. We are everyone who has ever walked among the aspens and felt the pull of belonging." Another Echo person stepped forward, this one wearing the face of someone I didn't recognize, a young woman with dark hair and frightened eyes. "I was a hiker," she said in a voice that sounded like autumn leaves. "I came here alone, just for the weekend, but they showed me such beauty, such connection. I chose to stay." More Echo people moved closer to the RV, each wearing a different face, each telling a story of choice, of surrender, of joining something larger than themselves. "The forest remembers everyone," said one in an old man's voice. "Every footstep, every word, every breath, we are that memory given form. We are the echo of every soul who found peace among the aspens." Emma pressed her hands against the window glass. "I want to remember too," she whispered. "Emma, no." I grabbed her shoulders, but she felt insubstantial, as if she were already half Echo herself. "Don't you see, Dad? They're not taking us. They're offering us a choice. We can keep fighting, keep running, keep being alone in our separate selves. Or we can join something eternal, something beautiful." Jake nodded slowly. "The Grove is alive, Dad. Really alive and lonely. It's been lonely for so long." Even Sarah was nodding, her eyes fixed on the Echo people outside. "They just want to belong to something. And they want us to belong too." I was losing them. The forest's influence was stronger than my ability to protect them. And worse, I was beginning to understand why. The Echo people weren't lying. They were offering a kind of immortality, a permanent connection, an end to the isolation that defined human existence. But at what cost? I looked out at the circle of Echo people and saw what Emma couldn't or wouldn't see. Yes, they wore human faces and spoke with human voices, but there was nothing behind their eyes. They were perfect copies with no original, echoes with no source sound. They weren't people who had chosen to stay. They were the forest's attempt to understand what people were, based on the memories and impressions left behind by visitors. They were echoes of echoes, growing fainter with each repetition. And if we joined them, we wouldn't become immortal. We would become source material for new Echo people, our essence diluted and copied until nothing real remained. "Listen to me," I said desperately, turning away from the windows. "All of you, listen to my voice. Remember who you are. Remember our life in Denver. Remember Emma's art classes, Jake's photography club. Remember Sarah's garden. Remember the way our house smells like coffee in the morning." For a moment, their attention wavered. Emma blinked, confusion crossing her face. I remember," she said slowly. "I remember drawing at the kitchen table while you made pancakes on Saturday mornings." "That's right," I said, seizing the opening. "Remember Jake teaching you to drive stick shift in the school parking lot. Remember the fight you had about borrowing each other's clothes." Jake shook his head as if clearing cobwebs. "Emma always stole my hoodies." "Still do," Emma said with a weak smile. Sarah pressed her hand to her forehead. "What's happening to us? Why did I think staying here was a good idea?" Outside, the Echo people had moved closer to the RV. They pressed their faces against the windows, their imperfect features twisted with something that might have been disappointment or hunger. "They're losing their hold on you," I said. "That's why we need to leave. Right now." "But the engine won't start," Jake protested. "Then we walk." "Dad, we're miles from the main road," Emma said, "and it's dark. Would you rather die trying to escape, or live forever as something that isn't really you?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Outside, the Echo people began to move, circling the RV slowly, their movements becoming more agitated. "They won't let us leave," Sarah whispered. She was right. The Echo people had formed a solid ring around us, standing shoulder to shoulder. And as we watched, more emerged from between the aspens. Dozens of them, all wearing faces of people who had visited the Grove over the years. But I noticed something else. They stayed carefully within the circle of massive aspens. Even as they pressed closer to the RV, none of them stepped outside the boundary formed by the ancient trees. "The Grove," I said suddenly. "They can't leave the Grove. They're bound to it somehow." I moved to the RV's driver area and tried the engine again. Nothing, but I noticed the keys were missing from the ignition. "Did anyone take the keys?" I asked. My family shook their heads. the keys had simply vanished. I searched every pocket, every compartment, every possible hiding place in the RV. No keys. It was as if they had never existed. Outside, the Echo people continued their slow circle. Occasionally, one would tap on the walls or windows with pale fingers. The sound was hypnotic, almost musical. "We have to go on foot," I said, "and we have to go now, while we still remember who we are. What if we can't find our way out?" Emma asked. "Then we'll die trying to be ourselves instead of living as copies." I gathered supplies, water bottles, energy bars, flashlights, the compass from our hiking gear. Sarah found our warmest jackets. Jake grabbed his camera and Emma clutched her sketchbook. "When I open the door," I said, "we run straight through their circle and don't stop until we're outside the grove. No matter what they say, no matter what they promise, don't listen." I put my hand on the door handle, took a deep breath, and looked at my family. Emma's face was pale but determined. Jake had his jaw set in that stubborn expression he'd inherited from his mother. Sarah squeezed my free hand. "Together," she said. I opened the door. The Echo people turned toward us as one, their borrowed faces reflecting our flashlight beams. For a moment, they simply stared. Then they began to speak, all at once, using voices we recognized. "Don't go," they said in chorus. "Stay with us. Be with us. Echo with us forever." But their words had lost their hypnotic power. In the open air, away from the confines of the RV, I could hear the hollowness beneath their voices. They were recordings, not real speech, memories of words without understanding. We ran. The Echo people tried to block our path, but they moved strangely in their attempt to stop us. Too fluid, too graceful, like they were underwater. We crashed through their line and sprinted toward the edge of the circular grove. Behind us, they called out in our own voices, "Michael, come back. Sarah, don't leave us. Emma, we love you. Jake, you belong here." But the voices grew fainter as we reached the massive aspens that formed the grove's boundary. And when we passed between them, stepping outside the circle, the voices stopped entirely. We didn't stop running until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. When we finally collapsed, gasping, in a small clearing, I turned back toward the grove. It was gone. Where the circular ring of giant aspens had stood, there was only normal forest. Regular-sized trees, scattered randomly with no pattern or purpose. If not for the compass in my hand and the terror still pounding in my hearts, I might have thought we'd imagined the entire thing. "Where is it?" Emma whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe it was never really there. Maybe it only exists for people who are caught by it." We found the main road just before dawn, exhausted and traumatized, but alive. A passing ranger gave us a ride to the nearest town where we caught a bus back to Denver. The RV was never found. According to the Forest Service, there was no record of our camping permit, no evidence we'd ever been there. Our camping gear, our clothes, our personal belongings, all of it had vanished as completely as the circular grove. But Emma's sketchbook had survived. The drawings were all there, page after page of faceless figures and impossible groves. Proof that what we'd experienced was real, even if no one else would ever believe us. We moved out of Denver 2 months later, relocating to a small city on the plains where the horizon is wide and visible and there are no forests for hundreds of miles. Emma stopped drawing for almost a year. Jake switched his major from photography to accounting. Sarah tore up her garden and planted only grass. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, we hear them calling. Not clearly, just at the edge of perception, like voices from a distant radio. Our own voices, calling to us from somewhere far away, promising connection, belonging, eternal peace in the echo. We don't answer. We've learned not to listen too hard. But Emma has started drawing again, and her latest sketch disturbs me. It shows our current house, surrounded by a grove of aspens that definitely aren't there in real life. In the drawing, pale figures stand among the trees, watching our windows, and their faces are getting clearer, more detailed, more accurate. Sometimes I wonder if we really escaped the grove, or if we just became a different kind of echo people. the ones who got away, but left enough of themselves behind to be remembered. The voices are getting stronger, and Emma's drawings are getting more detailed. I'm starting to think our escape was just the beginning of something else entirely. They warned us about the echo people, and we didn't listen. Now we're learning to echo back. Story 4. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from the Hualapai Mountains. I'm Marcus Reed, and I was 34 when I learned that some things in the woods aren't meant to be found. The RV had been sitting in my driveway for 3 months, a monument to failed promises and a marriage that ended with lawyers and bitter words. Sarah had wanted adventure, claimed I never took risks anymore. So I bought the damn thing, a 2019 Winnebago Vista that cost more than my first house. By the time the ink dried on the divorce papers, she was already living with her yoga instructor in Sedona, and I was left with 36 monthly payments on wheels I'd never wanted. But that October, something shifted. Maybe it was the empty house echoing with phantom arguments, or the way my neighbors looked at me with that particular brand of pity reserved for the recently divorced. I needed to prove something to myself, even if Sarah would never know about it. The Hualapai Mountains in northwestern Arizona seemed perfect. Remote enough for solitude, close enough to civilization if things went wrong. The ranger at the visitor center, a weathered woman named Janet, had been helpful but oddly insistent about certain things. Stay on marked trails, she'd said, her eyes never quite meeting mine. Don't camp past Aspen Springs, and if the sun starts setting early— She paused, studying my face like she was memorizing it. Get back to your vehicle immediately. I'd laughed it off as local color, the kind of spooky nonsense small mountain communities traded in to keep tourists on their toes. What could early sunset even mean? The sun follows a predictable schedule, doesn't it? The drive up Hualapai Mountain Road was spectacular in that bone-deep way that only the Southwest can manage. Saguaro cacti gave way to juniper and oak as I climbed, the RV's engine working harder with each switchback. By the time I reached the dispersed camping area near Wild Cow Springs, the October air had that crisp bite that makes you believe in fresh starts. I chose a spot 50 yards off the main road, tucked between 2 massive granite boulders that would shelter the RV from wind. Close enough to feel connected to civilization, far enough to pretend I was truly alone. The silence was immediate and complete. No traffic hum, no neighbor's leaf blower, no phantom Sarah moving through rooms she'd never see again. The first day passed uneventfully. I set up camp with the methodical precision of a man trying to prove his competence to an absent audience. Leveling jacks deployed, fresh water connected, awning extended to create a proper outdoor living space. I even managed to get the generator running on the first try, a small victory that felt disproportionately important. That evening, I grilled a steak on the little propane barbecue attached to the RV's side, ate it while watching the sun sink toward the western peaks. The silence was so profound I could hear my own heartbeat. When darkness finally came, it came all at once, like a curtain dropping. One moment the peaks were silhouetted against deep purple sky. The next, they were gone entirely, swallowed by a blackness so complete it seemed to have weight. I slept better than I had in months. The second day brought a different kind of quiet, the kind that makes you check your phone for signal bars every few minutes, just to confirm the world still exists beyond the granite walls of your temporary sanctuary. I took a short hike up the Aspen Springs Trail, following a creek that bubbled with the manic energy of recent mountain rains. The exercise felt good, cleansing in the way physical exertion always is when your problems are mostly mental. But something felt off on the walk back. The light seemed wrong somehow. Not just dimmer, but qualitatively different, as if someone had adjusted the color temperature of reality itself. I checked my watch. 4:15 p.m. The sun should have been high and bright, but it hung low and orange, casting long shadows that shouldn't exist for another 2 hours. I picked up my pace, telling myself it was the mountains playing tricks with perspective. Everyone knows mountain terrain can create optical illusions, make sunrise come late and sunset arrive early. But when I emerged from the tree line and saw my RV sitting in what looked like late evening light, my stomach dropped. The dashboard clock read 4:23 p.m. when I climbed into the driver's seat. My phone showed the same time, but outside the light continued to fade with unnatural speed, as if someone was slowly turning down a dimmer switch on the entire world. By 4:45, it was full dark. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, engine running, headlights cutting weak cones through blackness that seemed to press against the windshield like something alive. Every rational part of my mind insisted this was some kind of weather phenomenon, maybe storm clouds moving in fast from the west. But the sky I could see looked clear, stars already visible in what should have been afternoon light. The generator hummed to life when I switched it on, and the RV's interior lights pushed back the darkness in a way that felt like a small victory. I made coffee, opened a beer, tried to lose myself in a paperback thriller I'd been meaning to finish, but every few minutes I found myself checking the windows, confirming that yes, it was still impossibly dark outside, and yes, my clocks all still showed early evening. I was halfway through my second beer when I heard the footsteps. They started soft, almost like wind moving through dry leaves, but there was a rhythm to them that natural sounds don't have. Left, right, the deliberate cadence of someone walking with purpose, someone circling the RV. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I held my breath, beer halfway to my lips, listening so hard my ears rang with the effort. Nothing. Then, soft as a whisper, 3 knocks on the aluminum door. Tap, tap, tap. "Hello?" My voice came out as a croak. I cleared my throat, tried again. "Is someone there?" The knocking repeated. Same pattern, same gentle pressure, but no voice answered. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. Something about those knocks felt wrong. Too measured, too patient. Like whoever was out there had all the time in the world and knew exactly how this would play out. "I'm armed," I called out, which was a lie. "If you need help, just tell me what you need." The third round of knocking was different. Still 3 taps, but harder now, more insistent. And underneath it, barely audible, I heard something else. A sound like fingernails dragging across metal. I switched off the interior lights and crept to the small window above the dinette. The RV had motion sensor security lights mounted on all 4 corners, but they weren't coming on. I pressed my face to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block reflections. Nothing. Just darkness so complete it seemed solid. The footsteps resumed, continuing their circuit around the RV. I counted them. 64 steps to complete 1 full loop. Then the pattern repeated. And again. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to those methodical footsteps circling my temporary home like a predator marking territory. It could have been minutes or hours. Time felt elastic in that unnatural darkness, stretching and compressing in ways that made my head ache. When the footsteps finally stopped, the silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. I must have dozed off in the chair because I woke to gray dawn light filtering through the windows and a crick in my neck that felt like punishment for my middle-aged choices. The coffee maker was still gurgling, filling the RV with the rich scent of a morning that felt like salvation. Outside, the world looked normal again. Sunlight slanted through pine branches in the golden way that makes photographers weep with joy. Birds called to each other with mundane cheerfulness. The whole episode felt like a particularly vivid dream, the kind that leaves you unsettled for hours after waking. But when I opened the door to let in fresh air, I saw the prints. They circled the RV in a perfect ring, maybe 8 feet out from the walls. Human footprints, but wrong somehow. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the ends where toes should be. The depth was wrong too, pressed deep into dirt that should have been hard-packed, as if whatever made them weighed far more than physics suggested. I stood in the doorway, coffee cooling in my hands, staring at those prints and trying to construct a rational explanation. Maybe a bear. They could rear up and walk short distances, leaving prints that might look humanoid from a distance. But bears had paws, not feet. and bears didn't knock on doors with the patience of a door-to-door salesman. The prints were already fading as I watched, the edges blurring as if the earth itself was trying to forget they'd ever existed. By the time I went back inside for my camera, they were gone entirely, leaving only smooth dirt and the beginning of doubt about what I'd actually seen. I spent the day hiking again, this time pushing farther up the mountain than I'd planned. The physical exertion helped clear my head, and the October sunlight felt like a personal apology from the universe for the previous night's strangeness. I ate lunch on a granite outcropping with a view that stretched 50 miles in every direction. Nothing but mountain ridges and desert valleys rolling away toward horizons that seemed impossibly distant. But as afternoon wore toward evening, I found myself checking my watch obsessively. 3:30 p.m. Still plenty of light. 3:45 p.m. Sun high and bright. 4 p.m. Shadows starting to lengthen, but normally so. At 4:10 p.m., the light began to die. It wasn't gradual this time. One moment I was standing in full afternoon sunshine. The next I was watching darkness flow down the mountainsides like spilled ink. The sun didn't set. It simply vanished, as if someone had reached up and switched it off. I ran. The trail back to camp that had taken me 20 minutes to climb became a nightmare obstacle course in the sudden darkness. Roots reached up to snag my boots. Branches whipped at my face with malicious precision. I stumbled and fell twice, the second time hard enough to split my lip and fill my mouth with the copper taste of blood, but I could hear them behind me. The footsteps, dozens of them now, keeping pace with my panicked flight through trees that creaked and whispered in wind I couldn't feel. Sometimes they sounded close enough to touch, sometimes they seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the granite faces until I couldn't tell which direction was safe. The RV's security lights finally came on when I burst into the clearing, motion sensors triggered by my desperate sprint across the campsite. But the illumination only made things worse. Just at the edge of the light I could see them, shapes that might have been human if you didn't look too closely, standing absolutely still among the trees like mannequins positioned by a madman. I slammed the door behind me and threw every lock the RV had, including the deadbolt I'd never bothered with before. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the generator started. But finally the interior lights came on and pushed back some of the darkness pressing against the windows. The footsteps started immediately, but this time they weren't alone. Other sounds joined them, scratching at the walls, something heavy sliding across the roof, the soft thump of bodies pressing against the door. And underneath it all, barely audible but impossible to ignore, was a sound like whispering in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood was describing terrible things in loving detail. I grabbed my phone, thinking I'd call for help, but there was no signal. There had been 2 bars when I'd checked that afternoon, but now the screen showed nothing, not even searching, just an empty corner where the signal indicator should be. The scratching on the walls grew louder, more insistent. Long, slow scrapes that sounded like fingernails or claws dragging across aluminum siding. I could trace their progress around the RV's exterior, starting at the driver's side and working methodically toward the rear. Then the lights went out. Not just the interior lights, everything. The gentle hum of the refrigerator died. The LED readout on the microwave went dark. Even the tiny pilot lights on the propane appliances vanished, leaving me in a blackness so complete I couldn't see my own hands. The generator was still running. I could hear it chugging away outside, but somehow no power was reaching the RV's electrical system. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer, but my hands were shaking too badly to manage the simple task of opening it. That's when I heard the voice. Marcus. It came from directly outside the door, spoken in a tone of gentle concern that made my skin crawl. Marcus, are you all right in there? The voice was Sarah's. Not similar to Sarah's, not close enough to fool a stranger, but exactly Sarah's voice speaking my name with the same inflection she'd used 1,000 times during our marriage. The same slight upturn at the end. The way she pronounced the R, just a fraction softer than most people. Marcus, honey, open the door. I'm worried about you. My mouth went dry. Sarah was in Sedona, 300 miles away, probably doing downward dog with her new boyfriend while I lost my mind in the mountains. But that was definitely her voice, speaking with the patient concern she'd used during my worst depressive episodes. "I know you're scared, baby, but you don't have to be alone. Just open the door." I pressed myself against the far wall of the RV, as if putting an extra 3 feet between myself and the door would matter if something really wanted to get in. The voice continued, patient and loving and absolutely wrong in every way that mattered. "I left him, Marcus. I realized what a mistake I made. I drove all night to find you. The worst part was how much I wanted to believe it. Even knowing it was impossible, even with every rational part of my mind screaming warnings, some desperate corner of my heart wanted to open that door and find Sarah standing there with apologies and second chances. Please, Marcus. It's so cold out here. I just want to come home." The pleading note in her voice was perfect, exactly the way Sarah sounded when she was trying not to cry. It was that detail that finally convinced me this was real, that somehow my ex-wife had tracked me down in the middle of nowhere for a reconciliation that would fix everything wrong in my life. I reached for the door handle. My fingertips had just touched the metal when I heard it. Another voice, identical to the first, coming from the opposite side of the RV. "Marcus, why won't you answer me? I'm scared." Two Sarahs, speaking in perfect unison now, one at the door and one at the back window. The same words, the same inflection, the same heartbreaking vulnerability. But Sarah was one person, in one place, and that place was definitely not circling my RV in supernatural darkness. I jerked my hand back from the door handle like it had burned me. The voices kept talking, multiplying now, coming from every side of the RV. A dozen Sarahs, then 20, then too many to count, all pleading with me to let them in, all promising forgiveness and love and all the second chances a man could want. The sound built to a crescendo that should have been deafening, but instead felt muffled, as if the darkness itself was absorbing some of the noise. Then, abruptly, silence. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Finally, I managed to find my flashlight and get it working. The thin beam revealed the RV's interior exactly as I'd left it. Coffee cup on the table, book face down on the couch, everything normal except for the crushing weight of wrongness that pressed down like a physical force. Dawn was still hours away, but I couldn't stay inside any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in, and every shadow the flashlight created seemed to hide something watching me with patient hunger. I needed to see outside, needed to confirm that whatever had been circling the RV was gone. I eased the door open just wide enough to shine my flashlight out. The beam revealed empty dirt, scattered pine needles, nothing that shouldn't be there. But the silence was wrong. Too complete, too heavy. Even in the deepest wilderness there should be some sound. Wind in the trees, insects, the distant call of a night bird. This was the silence of a held breath, of a predator waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. I stepped outside. The flashlight beam seemed weaker out here, as if the darkness was actively working to absorb its light. I could see maybe 10 feet in any direction before the shadows swallowed everything. But I could feel them out there, just beyond the light's reach, watching with the patience of something that had existed long before humans learned to make fire. "I know you're there," I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "What do you want?" The response came from everywhere at once. Not Sarah's voice this time, but something older and infinitely more patient. It didn't speak in words, but somehow communicated directly with the primitive part of my brain that still remembered when humans were prey animals huddling around fires while much worse things moved in the darkness beyond. "We want you to choose." The thought appeared fully formed in my mind, not heard but simply known, the way you know your own name. And with it came understanding. These things, whatever they were, couldn't simply take what they wanted. Some cosmic rule required consent, required the prey to walk willingly into the trap, stay and become one of us, or leave and spend the rest of your life wondering if we followed you home. I looked back at the RV, its familiar bulk suddenly seeming like sanctuary and prison combined. I could get inside, lock the doors, wait for real dawn to come and burn away whatever was happening here. drive back to Phoenix and my empty house and my 40-hour work weeks, pretend this was all a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much change too fast. But I'd always wonder. Every unexpected shadow, every noise in the night, every time darkness came earlier than expected, I'd wonder if they had kept their promise and followed me home. Or I could stay, accept whatever transformation they offered, become part of the darkness that lived in these mountains. Never have to worry about divorce papers or house payments or the crushing weight of ordinary human failure ever again. It was tempting in a way that scared me more than anything else that had happened. "No," I said aloud, the word coming out stronger than I felt. "I choose to leave." The darkness around me shifted, and for a moment I thought they would refuse my choice, drag me, kicking and screaming, into whatever existence they offered. But then the oppressive weight began to lift, slowly, like a pressure releasing from a sealed container. Then go. But remember, we know where you live. I didn't wait to see if they meant it literally. I threw my gear into the RV with the desperate efficiency of a man fleeing a house fire, leveling jacks retracted and awning rolled up in record time. The generator started on the first try, and the electrical system came back online as if it had never failed. By the time I had the RV in gear and moving, real dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks. Not the gradual brightening of normal sunrise, but a sudden flood of light that sent the unnatural darkness streaming away like spilled water. I drove straight through to Phoenix, stopping only for gas and bathroom breaks, checking my mirrors obsessively for signs of pursuit that never came. But even in broad daylight, surrounded by traffic and strip malls and all the mundane evidence of human civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from just outside my peripheral vision. That was 6 months ago. I sold the RV the week after I got home. Took a massive loss on it, but I didn't care. Some things aren't worth the monthly payments. But they kept their promise. Every sunset comes too early now, at least for me. I'll be sitting at my desk at work, and suddenly the light outside my window will have that wrong quality, that orange tint that shouldn't exist at 3 in the afternoon. My coworkers don't seem to notice. They go about their business while I watch shadows grow long and dark in what should be bright sunlight. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my house, I hear footsteps circling just outside the walls. 64 steps to complete the circuit, then silence that lasts just long enough to let me hope it's over before they start again. The knocking hasn't started yet. But I know it's coming. They're patient, these things from the mountains. They have all the time in the world. And every day the darkness comes a little earlier than it did the day before. Story 5. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's Michael Williams. I had just turned 34 when we arrived at the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho. And it was the worst mistake of our lives. The bite mark on my forearm still throbs as I write this 3 months later. The doctors say it's psychosomatic, that there's nothing there anymore. But they're wrong. I can feel it spreading, changing me from the inside out. Sarah says I'm different now, that I sleep too deeply and wake up with dirt under my fingernails. She's right, but she doesn't understand. None of them do. It started as a simple RV trip. 4 couples, old college friends reuniting for the first time in years. Tom Bradley had bought a massive Class A motorhome after his tech startup sold, and he wanted to christen it with an adventure through Idaho's backcountry. Remote camping, he called it, away from cell towers and civilization. We should have stayed home. The Sawtooth Mountains stretched before us like jagged teeth against the September sky as our convoy of vehicles wound through the serpentine mountain roads. Tom's RV led the way, a gleaming 40-foot behemoth that seemed absurdly large for the narrow mountain passes. Behind him, Jake Morrison followed in his pickup truck, towing a smaller travel trailer. Sarah and I brought up the rear in our Jeep, loaded with camping gear and enough food for a week. "This is incredible," Sarah breathed, pressing her face to the passenger window as we crested a ridge. The wilderness spread out below us in an endless tapestry of evergreens and granite peaks. "I can't believe we've never done this before." I squeezed her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her fingers. We'd been together for 12 years, married for 8, and these trips with our old college crew had become sacred. Tom and Lisa, Jake and Monica, David and Rebecca, we'd all stayed close despite careers and kids scattering us across the country. There, Tom's voice crackled through the CB radio. Perfect spot up ahead. The clearing sat beside a crystalline mountain lake, surrounded by towering pines that whispered in the afternoon breeze. It was exactly what we'd hoped for. Pristine wilderness with enough space for our vehicles and a central fire pit area. The nearest road was miles behind us, accessible only by the rough Forest Service track we'd followed for the last 2 hours. No cell service, Jake announced, holding his phone above his head. We're officially off the grid. Perfect, Rebecca said, stretching her arms toward the sky. I need a break from the real world. We spent the afternoon setting up camp in a loose circle around the fire pit. Tom's RV dominated one side of the clearing. Its slide-outs extended to create a palatial living space. Jake positioned his trailer nearby, while the rest of us pitched tents on the opposite side of the clearing. As twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, we gathered around the fire pit with cold beers and camp chairs. The flames danced hypnotically, casting shifting shadows across our faces. This was what we'd come for. The peace, the camaraderie, the escape from our increasingly complicated lives. So, Monica said, poking the fire with a long stick, anyone know any good ghost stories? Actually, David said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone who'd clearly been waiting for this moment. I did some research on this area before we came. The local ranger station had some interesting stories. Oh, here we go, Lisa laughed. David and his spooky research. But something in his tone made me pay attention. David was a journalist by trade, methodical and skeptical by nature. If he was taking local folklore seriously, there might be something to it. The Shoshone tribes avoided this valley for generations, he continued, his voice dropping to match the mood. They called it the hungry place. Said something lived in these mountains that wore the skins of men and beasts. Skinwalker stories, Tom scoffed. Every remote area has them. Maybe, David said. But there have been incidents, recent ones. In the last 5 years, 7 hikers have gone missing in this region. 3 were found days later, miles from where they disappeared, with no memory of what happened. The others, he shrugged, never found. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness, and we all jumped slightly. What about the ones who were found? Sarah asked, despite herself. That's the weird part, David said. They all reported the same thing, being bitten by something in the woods. But when the rangers examined them, there were no bite marks, no wounds at all. Just psychological changes, aggression, night terrors. 2 of them ended up in psychiatric facilities. Okay, that's enough campfire stories for me, Monica said, standing up abruptly. I'm calling it a night. The gathering began to break up, people drifting back to their respective accommodations. Sarah and I were among the last to leave the fire, the flames now reduced to glowing embers. Think there's anything to those stories? She asked as we walked back to our tent. I shrugged, though something about David's research had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. Probably just wilderness psychology. People get lost, panic. Their minds fill in the blanks with whatever local folklore they've heard. But as we settled into our sleeping bags, I found myself listening to the night sounds with heightened attention. The rustle of wind through pine needles, the distant call of an owl, the soft lap of water against the lake shore. And underneath it all, something else. A sound I couldn't quite identify, like breathing, but too rhythmic, too deliberate. I was about to mention it to Sarah when exhaustion finally claimed me, pulling me down into uneasy dreams. I woke to Sarah shaking my shoulder, her face pale in the pre-dawn light filtering through our tent. "Mike," she whispered urgently, "something's wrong with Jake." Outside, our friends had gathered in a loose circle near Jake's trailer. He stood in the center, swaying slightly, his eyes unfocused and glassy. His shirt was torn, and dark stains that looked like blood covered his arms and chest. "Jake," Tom approached cautiously. "Buddy, what happened?" Jake's head turned toward the sound, but his movements were jerky, unnatural. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice was a harsh rasp I barely recognized. I went for a walk, he said slowly. Couldn't sleep. Heard something calling from the woods. Monica stepped forward, her face etched with worry. You're hurt. We need to clean those wounds. No wounds, Jake said, and there was something wrong with his smile. Too wide, showing too many teeth. Just changed. I moved closer and saw that Monica was right to be confused. Despite the blood staining his clothes, there were no visible injuries on Jake's exposed skin. The blood seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Jake, you're scaring us, Rebecca said. Maybe you should sit down. I feel fine, he insisted, but there was something hollow in his voice. Better than fine. Stronger. Like I can finally see things clearly. David pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight app, shining it toward Jake's face. In the harsh LED light, something glinted in Jake's eyes, a reflective quality that didn't belong in human pupils. We should get him to a doctor, I said. Load up the RV and head back to town. No. Jake's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. We're staying. This place, it's important now. I can feel it calling. The way he said calling sent ice through my veins. It was the same word David had used in his story about the missing hikers. Jake, you're not thinking clearly, Tom said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used in business negotiations. Something happened to you out there. We need to get you checked out. Jake's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Nothing happened to me, Tom. Something happened for me. I can see now what this place really is, what it wants. He turned in a slow circle, his arms spread wide, addressing all of us. It's been waiting so long for the right group, the right combination. We're going to help it spread. Spread? Sarah whispered. Before Jake could answer, he suddenly doubled over, retching violently. But instead of vomit, thick black liquid poured from his mouth, steaming in the cool morning air. The smell was indescribable, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur and something else, something fundamentally wrong. Monica screamed and stumbled backward. The rest of us stood frozen, unable to process what we were seeing. When Jake straightened up, the black substance was gone, absorbed into the forest floor like it had never existed. His face was calm again, almost serene. It's starting, he said simply. That's when I noticed the bite mark on my forearm. It hadn't been there the night before. I was certain of that. But now, a perfect crescent of puncture wounds decorated my left arm, just below the elbow. The marks were fresh, still seeping blood, but I had no memory of being bitten. Sarah, I said, my voice strangely calm. Look at my arm. She gasped when she saw the bite marks, then immediately began examining her own arms and legs. I don't have anything, she said, relief evident in her voice. A quick survey of the group revealed that I wasn't alone. Rebecca had a similar bite mark on her shoulder. David's was on his ankle. Lisa found hers on her neck, just below her jawline. Only Tom, Sarah, and Monica remained unmarked. What the hell is happening here? Tom demanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. For the first time since I'd known him, he seemed truly frightened. Jake was watching us with that unnatural smile, his head tilted at an angle that made my skin crawl. The sharing, he said. It's how it spreads, how it grows. How what spreads? I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. The hunger, Jake said. It's been trapped here for so long, feeding on the occasional hiker, the lost camper, but it was never enough. It needed a way to spread beyond these mountains. David, despite the bite mark on his ankle, was still thinking like a journalist. The missing hikers, he said slowly. The ones who were found with no memory. They were carriers, weren't they? You sent them back to spread whatever this is. Jake's smile widened impossibly. Some of them fought it, ended up in hospitals, psychiatric wards, but others embrace the gift. They're out there now, in cities across the country, sharing what they learned. The bite mark on my arm was beginning to burn. A deep, throbbing pain that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. When I looked down at it, the wounds appeared to be healing at an impossible rate, the edges already beginning to close. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice tight with panic. "Right now." "I agree," Tom said. "Everyone pack up. We're getting out of here." But Jake laughed again, that horrible glass-breaking sound. "You can't leave. Not anymore. The marked ones belong to this place now. Watch us," Tom shot back. But as he turned toward the RV, Jake moved faster than any human should be able to move. In the space between one blink and the next, he had crossed the clearing and stood blocking the path to the vehicles. "I can't let you take them away," Jake said, and his voice had changed again, deeper now, with harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. "They're still changing. The process isn't complete." That's when I felt it, a tingling sensation spreading outward from the bite mark on my arm. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was wrong, in a way that made every instinct scream danger. "Mike?" Sarah grabbed my hand and I could see the fear in her eyes. "Your eyes are reflecting the light." I touched my face, but it felt normal. When I looked around the clearing, however, everything seemed different. Sharper. The colors were more vivid, and I could make out details in the shadows that should have been invisible in the pre-dawn gloom. Beside me, Rebecca was going through a similar transformation. Her pupils had dilated until they nearly consumed her irises, and she kept licking her lips with a tongue that seemed longer than it should be. David was fighting it harder, pressing his hands against his temples and muttering, "This isn't real. This isn't real," over and over. But I could see the change beginning in him too. The way his head twitched at sounds the rest of us couldn't hear, the way his nostrils flared as if catching scents on the wind. "What did you do to them?" Monica demanded, and I was surprised by the strength in her voice. Jake's head turned toward her with that same unnatural, jerky movement. "I didn't do anything. I'm just the first course. The main meal comes later." The burning in my arm was spreading now, traveling up toward my shoulder and down toward my fingertips. With it came a terrible hunger, not for food, but for something else. Something I couldn't name but desperately needed. "The hunger," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "It's not just a story, is it? There's something in these mountains, something that feeds on life force," Jake finished, "on the essence of what makes us human. But it can't just take. It has to be given freely. That's why it needs carriers, willing hosts who can spread the infection." Sarah was backing away from me now, and I couldn't blame her. I could feel myself changing, could feel the thing inside me growing stronger with each passing moment. The bite mark had stopped bleeding entirely, the skin smooth and unmarked as if it had never been wounded. But the change was more than physical. My thoughts were becoming clearer, sharper, but also colder. The warm affection I'd always felt for my friends was fading, replaced by something that evaluated them in terms of usefulness and vulnerability. Sarah would be easy to turn. She trusted me completely, would let me close enough to... I shook my head violently, trying to dispel the thought. These weren't my ideas. They were coming from something else, something that had entered me through that impossible bite mark. "Fight it," I said to Rebecca and David, though I wasn't sure if the words came out clearly. "Whatever this thing is, we can fight it." But Rebecca was already lost. The transformation was complete in her eyes. They held no recognition, no humanity. When she smiled, her canine teeth had elongated into points that gleamed in the growing daylight. "Why fight?" she asked, and her voice carried those same impossible harmonics as Jake's. "This is what we were meant to become. Predators instead of prey." David was still struggling, but I could see him losing ground. His hands had curled into claws, and dark veins were visible beneath his skin, spreading outward from the bite mark on his ankle like some kind of supernatural infection. "Tom," I managed to say, focusing all my remaining human will into the words. "Take Sarah and Monica, get to the RV, leave us here." But even as I said it, I knew it was too late. The thing inside me was growing stronger, and it had no intention of letting the unmarked ones escape. They were too valuable, not as hosts, but as food. Their terror and life force would nourish the entity that had made its home in these mountains for countless centuries. Tom seemed to realize this too. Instead of running for the RV, he moved to put himself between the transformed members of our group and the three who remained unchanged. "There has to be a way to reverse this," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No reversal," Jake said, his form beginning to shimmer and change. His skin was taking on a grayish hue, and his limbs were elongating in ways that defied human anatomy. Only completion. The hunger was overwhelming now, drowning out my human thoughts with its intensity. I could smell the life force radiating from Sarah, could almost taste the fear in her blood. All I had to do was reach out and... "Mike, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't you. Fight it." Her words cut through the hunger like a knife, and for a moment I was myself again. The real Mike Williams who loved this woman more than life itself, who would die before hurting her. "Run!" I gasped, using every ounce of willpower I possessed. "All of you, run now." Tom didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Sarah and Monica, pulling them toward the tree line on the far side of the clearing. They had maybe a 50-yard head start before the things we were becoming would pursue them. But 50 yards in dense forest might as well have been 50 miles. Whatever we were turning into had senses far beyond human normal. I could track their heartbeats, could follow the scent of their fear through the trees. The last coherent thought I had was that we'd brought this on ourselves. We'd laughed at the warnings, ignored the local folklore, and walked willingly into the hungry place. Now, we were part of it. The next few hours exist in my memory as fragments, like scenes from a fever dream. I remember the chase through the forest, moving through the undergrowth with impossible speed and silence. I remember the taste of fear when we finally cornered them in a rocky outcropping near the lake. I remember Sarah's face when she looked at me, not horror, but heartbreak. She could see that whatever had been Mike Williams was gone, replaced by something that wore his face but served a different master. Tom tried to fight. I'll give him credit for that. He'd found a fallen branch the size of a baseball bat, and he swung it with desperate strength when we closed in. But we were beyond physical damage now. The blow that should have shattered my skull barely registered. Monica was the first to be bitten. Rebecca took her down with predatory efficiency, sinking elongated canines into her throat. But instead of blood, that same black substance flowed from the wounds, and Monica's screams faded into something like ecstasy. Sarah tried to run then, but there was nowhere to go. The rocky outcropping was a dead end, surrounded by steep cliffs that dropped into the lake. She pressed her back against the stone wall, holding a small camping knife with hands that shook like leaves. "Please," she whispered as I approached, "please don't let it take me." And that's when something unexpected happened. The human part of me, the part I thought was completely gone, surged back to the surface. For just a moment, I was Mike Williams again, looking at the woman I'd loved for over a decade. "I won't," I promised, and I meant it. But the promise I kept wasn't the one she expected. Instead of biting her, I grabbed her shoulders and threw her backward over the cliff. She fell 40 feet into the deep mountain lake, her scream cut short by the splash. The thing controlling me roared in fury, furious at being denied its prize. But some small part of my human consciousness had managed that one act of defiance. Sarah surfaced in the lake, gasping and struggling to stay afloat in the icy water. She was alive, but she wouldn't last long in water that cold. Hypothermia would claim her within minutes unless she could reach shore. Tom saw what I'd done and understood. Without hesitation, he dove off the cliff after her. I watched them both disappear beneath the surface and felt something inside me break. Not the infection, that remained as strong as ever. But whatever had been left of my humanity cracked apart, leaving only the hunger. That was 3 months ago. I came back to awareness gradually over the following weeks, like emerging from a long, dark dream. The memories of what we'd done in those mountains are fragmented and nightmarish, but they're mine now. I have to live with them. The official search and rescue report concluded that Sarah and Tom had drowned in the lake. Their bodies were never recovered, which doesn't surprise me. The lake was fed by underground springs and had currents that could carry bodies miles from where they entered the water. Monica was found at our campsite, catatonic but alive. She spent 2 months in a psychiatric facility before being released to her family. She doesn't remember anything about the trip, which is probably a mercy. Jake, Rebecca, David, and I were discovered by rangers 3 days later, dehydrated and disoriented, but otherwise unharmed. We each had slightly different stories about what had happened, but they all involved getting lost in the woods after Sarah and Tom's accident. The authorities attributed our confusion to trauma and exposure. None of us had any bite marks. The thing that lives in those mountains is patient and intelligent. It knows how to cover its tracks, how to send its new servants back into the world without raising suspicion. We look human, act human, pass every medical test. But we're not human anymore. The hunger never really goes away. It's manageable most of the time, like a low-level ache you learn to ignore. But sometimes, when I'm around people who are afraid or in pain, it flares up with an intensity that's almost overwhelming. I've learned to feed it in small doses. A handshake with someone who's grieving, standing close to a child who's lost at the mall, volunteer work at the hospital where I can absorb the ambient suffering. It's not enough to satisfy the hunger completely, but it keeps the thing inside me from taking complete control. Jake has been less careful. He moved to Portland after we got back, and there have been reports in the local news of people going missing near the hiking trails where he volunteers as a guide. They're found days later with no memory of what happened to them, but with new bite marks that heal impossibly fast. The infection is spreading, just as the entity planned. I've tried to research the thing that lives in the Sawtooth Mountains, but information is scarce. The Shoshone stories David mentioned are real, but they're fragments, pieces of a larger picture that's been deliberately obscured. What I've been able to piece together suggests that the entity is old, possibly predating human civilization in North America. It's not malevolent in any human sense. It's simply following its nature, feeding and reproducing like any other organism. The fact that it destroys human lives in the process is as irrelevant to it as the fact that we destroy bacterial cultures when we take antibiotics. It's also intelligent in ways that go beyond human understanding. The method it uses to create new hosts, the bite marks that appear without the victim's knowledge, the gradual transformation that preserves the host's memories and personality, suggests a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and biology. Sometimes I wonder if Sarah survived. The water in that lake was lethally cold, and even if she made it to shore, she would have been miles from civilization with no supplies or shelter. But she was strong, stronger than any of us gave her credit for. If anyone could have survived those mountains, it would be her. I tell myself she made it out, that she's somewhere safe, starting a new life under a new identity, staying as far from wilderness areas as possible. It's probably a lie, but it's the only thing that keeps me sane. Because the alternative, that I killed the only person I ever truly loved in order to save her from becoming a monster like me, is too much to bear. The bite mark on my arm is completely gone now. Not even a scar to show where it had been. But I can still feel it sometimes, throbbing in rhythm with something that isn't my heart. It's connected to the entity in the mountains, a permanent link that lets it influence my thoughts and actions. I know it's only a matter of time before the thing decides I've served my purpose as a scout and calls me back to the Sawtooth Mountains. When that happens, I won't be able to resist. I'll pack my car and drive north, ready to feed the hunger that's been growing inside me for months. But until then, I write. I document everything I remember about our trip, about the transformation, about the nature of the entity we encountered. Maybe someday someone will find these pages and learn from our mistakes. If you're reading this, if you're planning a trip to remote wilderness areas, please listen to the locals when they warn you about certain places. Those stories exist for a reason. They're not just folklore. They're survival instructions passed down through generations. Don't camp alone in areas where people have gone missing. Don't ignore the feeling that something is watching you from the darkness. And if you wake up with bite marks you don't remember getting, get as far away from the wilderness as you can and never go back. Because once it has you, Once you've been marked, it never really lets you go. The hunger is growing stronger as I write this. I can feel it gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, whispering promises of satisfaction if I just give in, just let it take control for a little while. I've been fighting it for 3 months, but I'm getting tired, and it's getting stronger. Soon, I think, I'll have to make a choice. I can try to fight it until it drives me insane, or I can embrace what I've become and accept my role as its servant. Or there's a third option, the one Sarah would have wanted me to choose. I've been carrying a small revolver since I returned from the mountains. Just a .38, nothing fancy, but it would be enough. One shot to the temple, and the infection dies with me. No more hunger, no more spreading the entity's influence. It would be the human thing to do. But as I sit here in the darkness of my apartment, feeling the bite mark that isn't there anymore pulse with alien life, I'm not sure how much humanity I have left. The mountains are calling. I can hear them in my dreams, in the spaces between heartbeats. They're telling me it's time to come home, and I'm starting to think they might be right. Found among the effects of Michael Williams following his disappearance in December 2024. Williams was reported missing by co-workers when he failed to appear for work for 3 consecutive days. His apartment showed no signs of struggle, but his computer was found running with this document open on the screen. His vehicle was discovered abandoned on a Forest Service road near Stanley, Idaho, approximately 15 miles from the Sawtooth National Recreation Area. Despite extensive search efforts, Williams has not been located. This document has been forwarded to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for review, along with similar accounts from Jacob Morrison, Rebecca Torres, and David Lopez, all of whom disappeared under similar circumstances in the weeks following Williams' disappearance.